kind of undergo this philosophical reasoning, right?
Yeah.
The issue, though, which you can then kind of counteract that is that they assume basic axioms from which they go on to reason, and they can operate within that sphere, right?
Yeah. And that, I think, and sorry to cut you off, but that, I think, needs some theological ground. So I think C.S. Lewis has this saying that when he was an atheist, he used to think about the universe being unjust.
What was the line to which he...
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the missing link here.
Okay, so I agree, but this kind of comes down to how we're defining axioms.
Yeah.
Because if we're understanding an axiom in its like proper sense, then an axiom is just, it's kind of like a proper basic belief.
Basically.
You can't go any further than it. So this kind of comes down to the whole kind of presuppositional framework where a theist may presuppose God, which can then explain ontological reality as we have it, creation and so on, and our rationality and morality and so on. But an atheist, it seems that they could also presuppose, say, a couple of other axioms, like just their own rationality, existence as it appears to them, as it can be, all that kind of stuff. And I'm not quite sure how to critique that if it is just an axiom which they're taking. We could go back and forth and be like, you shouldn't accept that axiom, you should accept this axiom, but it's too fundamental to dispute evidentially.
So Luca, right, about this, you're very right that if someone says, look, this is a properly basic belief and it's axiomatic, that it's hard to simply say to them, no, you can't have a basic belief because we all have basic beliefs. However, the point which I try and get the atheists to admit is that they have a belief which is basic, which they didn't arrive at using their reason. Because many of the neo-atheist arguments are rationality is the first primary thing, and all of our beliefs are based upon reason. And you can't say that and believe in basic beliefs at the same time, because there's a contradiction there.
Explain the contradiction.
So, if you accept the idea of a properly basic belief, axiomatic belief, that means it's not something you've rationally justified, right? And the neo-atheist narrative of the Dawkinites, of the Hitchens, of these guys is everything is rationalized. We don't take anything for granted. We're pure skeptics, and there's a contradiction between these two narratives.
Okay, yeah, I can imagine there would be a contradiction there. I think it wouldn't be as problematic if you presupposed your reason as an axiom and then from there said, okay, not that it will yield absolute certainty, but we can have what we should be doing and how we should operate through life, accepting beliefs, rejecting beliefs, should always be done through the lens of reason. As I'm arguing from an atheistic worldview now, should always be done through the lens of reason rather than revelation. I don't see something inherently contradictory with that. Because the axiom they've just presupposed, they're not saying reason is the absolute truth and that's the only thing, but they're saying that once you presuppose your own reason and faculties, then from there you should subject everything to reason. I think that seems quite...
it does, but that's if they say this is my presupposition.
So I think a lot...
And the neo-atheists, they don't like to admit that they have presuppositions. That's the problem.
So that's probably the biggest problem, is that they're not actually acknowledging where they're making certain axiomatic presuppositions. They're not acknowledging where they have quote-unquote faith in certain necessary assumptions. Although I think if you meet certain atheists who are coherent and consistent and admit that point, it's then harder to kind of dispute past that. I think
I mean, we don't want to dispute with them because what they're basically doing is they're saying this is my axiom and I'm carrying on. Right? And I have no problem as long as they are open about it, because what I can turn around as a Muslim or you as a Christian, Luca, can say is, well, I also have my presuppositions. So if I have presuppositions, you can't say I'm irrational, because you also have presuppositions. I think the entire problem with, and I don't think Alex falls into this so much, but more the other atheists, like Krauss and others, who are refused to admit there's any assumptions or presuppositions involved in their worldview. They think it's all derived from reason, pure reason.
I would agree with that.
Okay, so on to another point that you said about human rights, right? Now, one of the things I was arguing for in the debate is that human rights, especially the Western conception of human rights that we have in the Western world, this is just a corpse of Christianity. This didn't come from an atheistic worldview. What's your thoughts on this?
I mean, I haven't read up enough historically around it, but I would, from what I've heard and just kind of understand, especially when you take it from kind of an American perspective as well, like in the Constitution and so on, I can see a lot of just Judeo-Christian grounding for the ideas of human rights. Although I would say that especially in the current day, we have a lot of baggage, as it were, a lot of kind of influence that is still coming from Enlightenment thinking, which didn't it ended up having to still rely on certain Christian or theistic axioms, even though it wouldn't admit it. But by and large, how they actively conducted it, they were doing it separate to religion, and they still kind of argued for these things of human rights. So especially someone like Mill. I could largely agree that it does have to have this kind of historical grounding in Judeo-Christian theism.
And you know, Douglas Murray, although he's an atheist, he also says something very interesting in his book, The Strange Death of Europe, that human rights has become into the sort of religion, and people are not really certain of its beginning. But in reality, it's a manifestation of the Christian dream. You know, this idea that we have inherent rights and we have these types of things. And interestingly now, a lot of the cases for human rights are being used against the Christian world, right? And being used to critique the Christian world, which is ironic because that was the very genesis of this idea in the Western world.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is fallacious when you critique something which you're having to presuppose in order to make that argument in the first place.
Okay, so about faith, and I want to get on to obviously Islam and Christianity in a bit, but about faith, of course, you must have seen in Oxford there's a rise of atheism. There's a lot of people who are inclined towards that. At the same time, I've seen some people turn back to Christianity or turn back to Islam from atheism. Do you think there's a trend now where new atheism is dying and people are turning back to religion? Do you think we're seeing a change now?
Yeah, I would say so. I think a lot of people have become quite practically disillusioned with the narrative that the new atheist worldview kind of espouses. It just doesn't account for their lived experience. It doesn't kind of plug in actual, deep gaps in their heart which they're having to grapple with. Whether that then means that they kind of emotionally then just go and grasp at anything, which can also be a bit of a problem. I think that kind of explains a lot of big thinkers and like speakers like Jordan Peterson and so on, where they.
I was about to mention him.
Yeah, so like it makes sense in this kind of vacuum why these ideas have a lot of traction, because they tap into this kind of lack that people have found. Whether it's true or not is a really separate question, but it is very understandable, and I have seen that. I've definitely seen people who, at the very least, are curious. They want to hear a kind of better narrative than the one that they've held to and is being pumped quite widely around them.
The way I see it is new atheism is attractive at a certain age and for a certain intellect. But as soon as you get past that, the arguments that Jordan Peterson puts forward, I don't agree with him with some of the things he says about Islam, but the other things that he says about nihilism is exactly on point. I understand why new atheism can lead to depression, new atheism can lead to a sense of meaninglessness, and it doesn't really have anything to offer.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to now Islam. What do you know about Islam, and what do you think about the differences between Islam and Christianity?
It's obviously a huge subject to say what I know about Islam. To be fair, a lot of it is stuff that I have known and then forgotten, so that's problematic in one level. But
you're studying philosophy, so I'm guessing you came across some Islamic theologians.
So I picked an classical Islamic studies.
Interesting.
But it was very interesting. A lot of it was looking at the kind of philosophy and medieval philosophy in Islam. Obviously, really interesting, really enjoyed it. But it wasn't so much of the kind of systematic theology approach, looking at doctrines, Tawheed versus Trinity, that kind of stuff, which is more I'm interested in. By and large, I kind of understand the gist of that. Islam comes, depending on how you define Islam formally with Muhammad and so on, comes after Christianity, just historically speaking. A lot of Muslims would understand that actually Islam, in the sense of the word, and being a Muslim, is a kind of much more universal principle. It could be someone who would be a perhaps professing Christian but not really understanding properly. They could still be Muslim. The prophets in the past would be Muslims because they submitted to one God and understood that.
You know a lot.
That kind of stuff. And there's obviously, between Christianity and Islam, there are like key differences. So Trinity versus Tawheed. Did Jesus really die on the cross? Was Jesus divine? Biblical scriptures. Did Jesus rise from the dead? How salvation? Blah blah blah. Lots of things. There's a lot of crossover, but a lot of disagreement.
Okay, so about your own faith, were you always a Christian, or did you arrive at Christianity?
So I became a Christian when I was about 15 or 16.
That's usually the time people are thinking about this stuff.
I kind of grew up going to a church, not necessarily from a really Christian background, but grew up going to a church, knew a lot of the principles and ideas, didn't really adhere to it properly, and then kind of just, by and large, kind of acknowledged, just to be consistent on an intellectual level, if this is true, then I have to be living differently. That was just an intellectual belief. And then there's much more the kind of practical experience of, knowing God, having a relationship, being born again, that type of thing. That kind of all came in around the same time, and then after that was when I started investigating Christianity further.
Okay. Luca, that's quite interesting, because normally when I speak to ex-Christians or people become atheists, it's usually around the age of 15 that they leave Christianity.
Yeah.
And they come to Christianity perhaps, like that gentleman over there with the beard, I'm not sure if you can see him. He's standing up on that with the blue shirt. So he's a former militant atheist, actually. I've spoken to him before. And he became a Christian, right? And what's interesting, I just want to share something. So I was speaking to him about Christianity, and he said that he was addicted to pornography. And I don't mind saying this on camera, because obviously he spoke to me about this and he's open, that he was addicted and he felt guilty. He felt sinful.
Yeah.
So he turned to Christianity to look for salvation, to look for forgiveness, right? So you have people like him who turn to Christianity or Christians, atheists who become Muslims later on in their 20s. You did it quite early. What was the cause of that?
I mean, if I was a Calvinist, I could say God then drew me to it. I'd say it was a lot of things. It was on the rational, intellectual side, kind of just, for a short period of time, I kind of grappled with just atheism and kind of the rabbit hole that would lead me down, and nihilism, and just thinking.
Quite an early age for that.
Yeah, I kind of just clocked on to what this would actually mean. And so I guess in one part there was like spiritual or emotional motivation that I don't necessarily want to adhere to a worldview where I can literally just go around stealing, murdering, raping, and it doesn't.
And life is meaningless.
Yeah, and like, why don't I just smash up something and go talk to a chicken? Like, why don't I just live completely absurdly, right? When you just push it to its extreme. Yeah. So there was that, obviously. There was kind of.
But that seems quite attractive. I mean, one of the things I speak about is that atheism is the opiate for the misguided. It gives you this moral freedom to basically do what you want, and at that age, sometimes that's very attractive.
Yeah, that is very attractive. I understand that.
Like girls, drugs, women.
I think also probably because coming around to that age, like I'm not going to lie and say like, oh, I was really that bad, but like I'd sinned enough, or at least because I had some sort of Christian upbringing, I was more acutely aware that these are problematic. So a lot of it was my conscience kind of speaking out against me, or God kind of with my conscience speaking out against me, telling me these things are really not okay just because society condones whatever.
In Islam, we call them fitra.
Yeah. You
know about that, yeah?
Vague, I know the concept.
Yeah. Your innate disposition.
Yeah. So a lot of it was that, and it was kind of around that age I also started reading the Bible for myself rather than just listening to what I was told in church kind of thing. So I started reading the Bible for myself, and it was a lot more, when you're in church listening to someone preach to you, you can kind of distribute responsibility of the message, right? When you're just reading something one-to-one and you just have to grapple with it there, I then had to deal with the full weight of it. So it's kind of the positive side of the grace of God, the mercy of God, all that kind of stuff. But then the serious side of
fire and brimstone,
wrath of God, all that kind of stuff. And all of that kind of hemming me into repenting and turning and trusting in God.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So now, when it comes to Islam, now we as Muslims, we believe that there's one God and that Jesus didn't die on the cross. He's not God's son. He's not divine, he's a human messenger, and he worshipped God, right? Ultimately worshipped God. So how do you reconcile the idea that, even you as a Christian, you do believe that Jesus worshipped God, essentially, right? He did acts of worship.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that with the idea that he is divine?
Okay, so I think it would depend in some ways how we're defining worship here. I think on one level, if you link in like praying, for example, I think we can. So on one level, there's the answer that Jesus in his incarnate form, 33 years, he decided to submit himself, and in that sense, he occupied a state which therefore he would venerate the Father from that kind of lower position.
So you believe Jesus is lesser than the Father?
No, I don't say he is in principle lesser than the Father, but he submitted himself for a finite period of time in order, whatever, as in for the fulfillment of prophecies and to save people, all that kind of stuff. There's also just the general point that praying to God, I think, doesn't necessarily insinuate kind of your respective ontological status. So I don't think Jesus praying to God, therefore you say, oh, God's the higher one, Jesus is the lower one, right? Because I think if you understand prayer, especially in terms of communication and relationship and that type of thing, then that's not necessarily, it doesn't implicate ontological like stuff either way, it's nothing, right? So
well, I would say it does, because you're essentially submitting, like you said.
Yeah.
You're saying there's an authority greater than me, essentially. Like where we both agree is, in terms of the purpose of life, is to worship God. We both agree with that. The conception God is different, but you see, Islam is very much adamant on the status of Jesus, because it believes that by deifying him, you actually nullify all of your good deeds, right? So the Islamic paradigm is that if you hear about the message of Islam and you reject it, anything good that you do, and you know, in the Quran, God describes the Christians as the closest to the Muslims, right? Even though theologically we're closest to the Jewish people, in terms of Islam and Christianity, God says that we're the closest, right? And that one theological problem that Muslims see, which is the divinity of Jesus, that nullifies all good deeds to the point that the person is no longer eligible for paradise. Which is why, you know, the whole Trinity versus Tawheed debates are so important for Muslims.
I understand that, yeah. Wait, so as far as like, so you're saying from an Islamic perspective, or just when you say that acknowledging or accepting Jesus' divinity nullifies all other deeds? Are you saying that was a shirk? Or
yeah.
Like, okay, yeah, I can understand. Yeah.
And look, obviously, I don't want to give you a whole entire sermon about this. You're smart enough to know that you're going to be studying this at Oxford and all the rest, but do you have a copy of the Quran?
Yeah.
Okay. So in chapter 19, the chapter of Mary, it goes through some theological argument for why Jesus is not God, right? About his limited nature, his knowledge, his worship, and these types of things. And what do you think of those Quranic verses, if you've read them?
I feel like I probably have read them. I can't remember off the top of my head. But can you give me an example one?
Okay. So, and by the way, I'll give you this. This is a very good translation. Which translation do you have?
I've got Hikdal, Sahih. I've got about 4 different ones. I got like a
Sure. This is the best one, the Clear Quran. This is the best one, right? This just came out maybe a few years ago, and this one's in terms of these types of themes. Noah's son, Noah pleading for his son. So here, hold the mic for a second, please. So chapter 19, this is the chapter, and in this chapter, I don't remember the exact verse, I should really have highlighted it, but basically what it speaks about is that Jesus, basically in the Quran it mentions that he eats, he's limited, he worships God, and it asks people to reason about that, to reason about his limited human nature, and it tries to argue that is sufficient reason to understand that he cannot be divine.
Okay. Obviously, I disagree with that. I think that I say there's a sufficient amount of kind of just Christian writings at the time and then afterwards that kind of grapple with these issues, and you can kind of investigate it on that ground. I would just say kind of immediately there doesn't seem to be an inherent contradiction between an omnipotent God choosing, as he kind of foreordained and so on, to occupy human flesh and accept those limitations willingly and then go along with that. I don't see an explicit logical contradiction there.
So the argument of the Quran, so the argument of the Quran is essentially that is beyond, that's a way of humiliating God. That's a way of basically, it doesn't befit the majesty of God. And the verse that comes to mind is that the idea that God becomes human and God has a son, if the heavens heard it, the heavens would actually rupture. So I would say, in a way, and not in a rude way at all, but I would say in a way, you may have become desensitized by hearing it over and over again. Oh, your friend Gabriel's here. Okay, so I'll let you off, right? So, but you may have become desensitized because in the Quran, and also if you look at the ancient Jewish scriptures as well, the whole idea of God having any human-like traits or any of these things is heavily blasphemous.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't think there's a problem there, because we're not saying that God in his intrinsic nature is a human, right? Where like that's not what's being asserted.
Yeah. No, I believe you. Yeah.
So there wouldn't be a contradiction between the descriptions of saying that God is not a man, for example. Also, that verse, I think it's in Malachi, which says God is not a man that he should lie, but focuses on him telling the truth. Anyhow, you can still say God is not a man, but that wouldn't contradict when Jesus, God the Son, takes on human flesh as a man, because that's not his intrinsic ontological state.
But even if it's not intrinsic, we believe ultimately it's blasphemous.
Yeah.
But anyway, because you're friends here, I'll give you this copy.
Yeah, sweet, yeah.
Also, there's another really interesting book which is about the end time prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Yeah.
And this goes through modern day occultist people like Aleister Crowley and also ancient Mayan predictions and stuff like that. Anyway, would you like to give any last thoughts to this type of dialogue in Speaker's Corner and how it was?
Yeah, no, this good fun, can't complain. It's probably better than a lot of the discussions we have here, because either you have someone up on a ladder who's preaching and they can finish their points, but then there's not much personal interaction back and forth. If you have a lot of one-to-one discussions with people on the ground, though, it can be personal, but then you get hecklers, people don't get to finish their points, it just goes off to side topics. I think just having cordial, respectful conversations that each person speaks their points, goes through respectfully, listens, takes stuff away, researches it, comes back next week with more stuff. I think this is the best way forward, and we need to have more of this kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for joining. I'd like to get your email address if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's all right.
Just send me a blank email. So, by the way, this book is very important from an Islamic philosophy point of view, right? So you can have that one as well. Have you seen Lawrence Krauss's debate with Hamza?
I've seen portions of it.
Yeah, that's his book.
Yeah.
Are you Polish?
No, half Serbian.
Oh, I was going to say because your name, yeah. Cool. But it's really nice talking to you.
Yeah, you too.
See you next time.
Also, they are in hospital.
Which one's yours?
We are no better than them.
Who's this?
Come together. Let us reason